Wominjeka. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're organising this event from the unceded lands of the Kulin and their nearby nations. Michael, our speaker, is on Wadwurrung country, and Chris, Rick, Imogen, and myself are on Wurundjeri land. Peter is on Boonwurrung country. They have all cared for and managed these lands in a sustainable and responsible manner for many tens of thousands of years. When the initial settlers arrived, the common statement was the land was like a gentleman's park and the soils so friable with good grasses and bulbs. We need to respond to their welcome by truly caring for this country. We have much to learn from them, not only on their land, farming and fire practices, but also their governance procedures, which led to no major wars across this continent for many tens of thousands of years. I offer my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all of their mobs, and to people from other mobs attending today, and to all of you who have logged in from near and far, and I think even some from overseas. Hi, I'm Rob Gardner, and I help organise these meetings with Chris, Peter, and Rick. Today, my particular thanks to Imogen from BZE, who is managing all the activities in the background. BZE has very kindly come to our assistance, as we knew is still trying to recover from its recent restructure. And once again, I'd like to thank our previous coordinator, Doug, for all his great work and support. Firstly, some housekeeping. Tonight's presentation and Q&A will be recorded and available to be downloaded in a few days from both the Renew and BZE websites. If you have any technical problems or general comments, please use the chat button at the bottom left on computers. If you have questions, enter them at any time during the presentation using the Q&A button at the bottom center. Please keep the questions short. We usually have a lot of questions, so we'll probably consolidate similar ones and then cover as many as possible in the time available. As some of you are new to these webinars, briefly, Renew was formed in 1980 to promote sustainability in all its forms. It's best known for its two magazines, Renew and Sanctuary, but also events such as Sustainable House Day and Speed Date and Expert, which are both virtual this year. Also electric vehicle fairs and attending many other fairs and festivals and events throughout the country. However, it also has a significant research section and a lobbying group and free modelling packages like Sunlighter and Tankulator, and also an advisory service aimed not only for households, but is offered to businesses and governments. BZE is an internationally significant climate change not-for-profit think tank. It has an extensive research capability and produces some world-breaking reports. These studies have covered all major sectors of the Australian economy and show how zero carbon outcomes can be achieved within 10 years and the transition route to achieve it. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have Michael Lord presenting the BZE Million Jobs Plan. Michael will be known to many of you as he's presented his previous BZE reports on rethinking cement, electrifying industry, and previously some other groundbreaking BZE research reports. Michael has been a key person in environmental research in Australia for many years and previously in the UK. So without much delay, I'd like to pass over to Michael.
Fantastic. Thanks for that introduction, Rob. And thanks to Renew for inviting me along. As you said, you've invited me a few times, and I think there's a lot of great connection between Beyond Zero Emissions and Renew. I think with the two NGOs in Australia that look at technology as a solution to tackling climate change. I'd like to say that I'm talking from Ballarat, and as you said, I'm on the lands of the Wadawurrung people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Beyond Zero Emissions Million Jobs Plan, which we launched at the end of June. Normally when I get to talk about this, I get about 10 or 15 minutes. So it's great. One good thing about presenting at Renew is that you like a lot of technical detail. So I get a bit of a kind of luxurious amount of time to present, which is great. Just trying to get to the next screen. So Rob said that Beyond Zero Emissions we show that it's achievable and affordable to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions and transition to a zero carbon economy. We don't just show that, and that's with existing technology, and we also show how it's going to be great if Australia does this. For all sorts of reasons, Australia will be can look forward to a future where we eliminate emissions. And this presentation is one of those reasons, which is that it will create a lot of jobs. So the situation back in April, I'd actually left Beyond Zero Emissions. I was head of research for a few years, and I left for a bit of a break. And then coronavirus happened. And by April, that health crisis had translated into an economic crisis for Australia and countries around the world. And unemployment ballooned overnight. It went up about from 6% to about 11% in short order. And the governments around Australia, to their credit, were very quick to throw billions of dollars at the economic problem, just as life support for Australia's industry, for Australia's economy. So I got a call from the people at Beyond Zero Emissions, and they said, would you like to get involved in a jobs plan, a plan which looks at how to get Australia out of the current economic crisis and creates jobs? And I said, yeah, you bet. This was a moment really that was designed for Beyond Zero Emissions. We have, as Rob said, prepared reports that look at all the sectors that produce emissions and how we can eliminate the emissions. And we've often spoken about in those reports how eliminating emissions can create jobs and improve the economy. But I guess it hasn't been front and center of what we've said, that this was an opportunity to make jobs front and center and to show how climbing out of what we hope is a short-term economic crisis can also mean tackling the long-term, but ultimately even more serious crisis of climate change. And around the same time, it was becoming pretty standard around the world for politicians and economists to say that what we needed was green stimulus. Got two quotes here from two organizations, the International Energy Agency and the International Monetary Fund. I could have chosen similar quotes from many organizations that were all saying, let's put clean energy at the heart of stimulus plans. And even governments that we're not used to hearing this from, let's say the government of South Korea, were saying similar things. In Germany, they've since announced $36 billion green stimulus package as part of their COVID recovery. In France, 13 billion, sorry, that's euro, so it would be even more dollars. And many countries around the world have done the same things. And another thing that was becoming sort of mainstream and widely accepted is that investment in clean energy creates more jobs than investment in fossil fuels. So, as I say, this was a perfect moment for Beyond Zero Emissions to show how, through all the sectors we've spoken about, energy, transport, manufacturing, etc., we can create jobs at this moment. And one of the beauties of green stimulus is that it accelerates a trend that is happening anyway. It's happening because of the development of technology and because of lower cost solar and wind and other technologies, but it's also happening because of the politics around climate change. So we've got the Paris Climate Agreement. Every country in the world currently is signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement. The US hasn't quite left yet. They're in it for a few months. And in Australia, every state and territory has commitments to net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier. So even if Australia federally hasn't got a net zero emission commitment, the whole of Australia actually has at the state and territory level. The other reason why this is going to happen anyway is because of the actions by corporations and investors. So at least 1,000 global corporations have committed to emissions reductions targets in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. And investors are becoming increasingly vocal about their interest in seeing the companies they invest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So they increasingly see high carbon as high risk, and they're reacting to that either by divesting from fossil fuel companies or making their opinion known at high carbon companies that they want to see a strategy to low and then zero carbon. And this kind of corporate action is going to ripple through the supply chain and the global economy. So nobody really gets the choice to opt out. I'll give you one example of what I mean by that. So Volkswagen and Toyota are two of the companies that have set themselves emissions reductions targets, but they've also done that for their whole supply chains. In the case of Volkswagen, they have 40,000 suppliers that deliver various things so Volkswagen can make their cars. Volkswagen and Toyota both aim to make zero emissions cars. And that's not just zero emissions in operation, but in the entire manufacture of those cars, the entire life cycle of them. So Volkswagen have already actually released a zero emissions car, a carbon neutral car called the ID3, I think it's called. It's an electric car. And in manufacturing that, they realized that the component of the car that contributed most to emissions was the battery. So they required the battery maker, LG Chem, which is a big global battery maker, to, at their plant in Poland, which was servicing Volkswagen, they required them to switch to renewable energy. So LG Chem, without themselves having climate commitments, had to conform to the climate commitments of Volkswagen. And I think this is just a little story in microcosm of what is going to happen increasingly throughout the economy, and manufacturers everywhere, whether they have a target or not, are going to have to conform to the targets of big corporations like VW and Toyota. So the Million Jobs Plan, it does what it says. It shows how we can create 1 million jobs, actually 1.8 million jobs, by transforming the Australian economy and tackling greenhouse gas emissions in those sectors that produce greenhouse gas emissions. So the main areas of jobs that we found were in renewable energy and transmission, the whole energy sector, buildings, both building new buildings and retrofits, transport, buses, trains and cycling, manufacturing and mining, land regeneration and land use, and waste recycling. And then a smaller number of jobs in training, education and research. So we looked at the way we looked at these jobs was over a 5-year period. We had some principles that we used to guide our finding of employment opportunities. So obviously a principle was that it creates jobs and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. They were the two key principles. but they also had to create jobs quickly. So there are some opportunities for Australia, for example, producing green steel, which I might touch on in a little while, which do have the potential to create many, many jobs, but not too many in the next 5 years. At least we don't think so. We also wanted to target affected geographic areas of Australia and sectors that have been affected by unemployment due to coronavirus. We wanted to highlight the opportunities of domestic production and manufacturing, and we also wanted to leverage, as far as possible, private sector investment. So there's certainly a role for fiscal measures from the federal government, but as far as possible, it would be great to keep that off the public balance sheet and to leverage private sector investment. The jobs we found, and a lot of this presentation I'm going to go through the different sectors and how we see jobs being created there and what we see happening in those sectors. Some of them are short-term construction jobs, and some of them are, many of them in fact, are ongoing jobs that will last beyond the 5-year period we're looking at, and in fact indefinitely. The biggest sector where we found jobs was buildings, so that's a really important one, and also close to the heart of Renew, I think. So yeah, even with the luxurious time that Renew has given me, I'm not going to be able to talk about everything in the report, but you know, we've got time for questions at the end, so I'd be really happy to chat in more detail about any aspects. So renewable energy underpins a lot of the report. In the past, there's been a criticism from some quarters that renewable energy projects are a term you often hear as a short-term sugar hit when it comes to employment. And that's because the main forms of renewable energy, solar and wind, can be built in a year, maybe 18 months, not more than 2 years. And in the current context, there are two responses to that criticism. One is a short-term sugar hit right now is actually one of the things we need. We need to create jobs very quickly. We probably need to create something like 1 million jobs by the end of this year. But the more important and more long-term answer is that is just the starting point. Those jobs in renewable construction is just the starting point, and they allow many of the other jobs that I'm going to talk about in mining, in manufacturing, in transport to be created. And the reason for that is Australia's exceptional potential in renewable energy. So this is a map actually from the Grattan Institute, so thanks to them for sharing it with us. It shows the blue areas, good wind potential, the sort of peachy areas, good solar potential, and then the dark orange areas, good solar and wind. And as you can see, Australia is one of the best places in the world for that. When you also factor in the size of that potential and things like Australia is a place of economic stability, political stability, people like to invest here. It's a developed country. It's really unique in the renewable energy potential. Beyond Zero Emissions had a report out in 2015. I believe we coined the phrase renewable energy superpower, which has been repeated a lot since. And that was really based on this fundamental physical capability of Australia to produce, it's effectively limitless renewable energy. So we just have to work out how to convert that potential into economic success and also exports to replace some of the exports that will be declining as we tackle climate change. And why it's really the moment to exploit this potential is that I think most people listening to this will know that the cost of renewable energy has really, it's just gone through the floor over the last 10 years. It was just a few years ago, it used to be expensive. It was more expensive than its fossil fuel competitors. That's no longer the case. In most countries in the world, certainly in Australia, solar, PV and wind are the cheapest ways to generate electricity. And with the falling cost of batteries and other forms of energy storage, even with storage, it's now competitive against coal and wind. So it's becoming less and less an argument now that we can't afford it. Quite the opposite. This is the source of cheap energy, and cheaper in Australia than other places because we have so much potential. So the first of our chapter 1 of the Million Jobs report, which shows we can create, I think it's about 140,000 jobs in the renewable energy sector. It paints a scenario of Australia fast-tracking 90 gigawatts of renewable energy projects. That's mostly solar and wind over the next 5 years. To put that into context, so we envisaged 15 gigawatts a year for the first 2 years and 20 gigawatts a year for the next 3 years. To put that into context of what we've done recently, in 2018 and 2019, Australia installed about 5 or 6 gigawatts of renewable energy. So it's certainly a step up from what we've done in the past, but not unrealistic, especially when you consider that there are 160 gigawatts of renewable energy projects already in the pipeline. And about a quarter of those have got as far as they have planning permission. So a strategy to fast track 90 gigawatts really just has to release this pent up demand of well over $100 billion of investment in renewable energy. This would be supported by also fast tracking transmission projects and storage. So we've suggested the need to back up that 90 gigawatts of renewables, about 20 gigawatts of batteries and other storage. This is just another story that you may have seen in Renew Economy or other sources, which shows how the appetite for renewable energy, once we give it the right encouragement, the appetite of investors to invest in Australia is really enormous. So the New South Wales government released an expression of interest for a renewable energy zone for 3 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's what they were looking for. They received replies totaling 27 gigawatts of renewable energy. So it was 9 times oversubscribed. And if you haven't been watching New South Wales, there have been great things happening there in the backing of the government for renewable energy and other things we're talking about in the Million Jobs Plan. So that's really good news. One of the ways of ensuring we create as many jobs as possible from this rapid build out of renewable energy is to ensure that at least some of the infrastructure is built here in Australia. So I think there's infrastructure which we wouldn't want to build here. I don't see Australia becoming a major manufacturer of solar panels. Other countries, especially China, do it so well and so cheaply. So we'd probably import the solar. But wind, certainly, which is very hard to transport long distances. The towers are so big now, the towers and the blades. And wind turbine manufacturers, once a market is large enough, usually set up shop in that market. So if we were to build, of that 90 gigawatts, I'm talking about 30 gigawatts of wind in Australia, that would create 9,000 workers, which would be, we've got a small wind industry at the moment, but it would be a significant new industry. And many of these jobs, I should say, in renewable energy are in the regional areas which need jobs the most. I mentioned transmission. So transmission lines are really the arteries of the energy system. Many of you'll know that we are not building transmission quickly enough to take advantage of renewable energy, but this is a project that really caught my attention. I was on a webinar for the Copper String project earlier today. The plan is to connect Townsville in North Queensland with Mount Isa, 1,000 kilometres away in Western Queensland. And this would be done with largely private finance. Why this is exciting to me is that it allows many of the things to happen that we talk about beyond zero emissions and that we talk about in the Million Jobs Plan. So One, it would reduce the energy costs at Mount Isa. That's significant because they have a copper mine there and a copper refinery that are very heavy energy users. So it would allow them to reduce their costs and reduce their emissions. The line would open up a whole load of great areas for wind and solar. Again, allowing that to be used at either end of the transmission line. Townsville is on the national electricity market, so it would allow that wind and solar to be plugged in to the whole national electricity market. And it would also allow new mineral resources. There is lots of copper, gold, silver, zinc, and other minerals at that western end. It would lower the power price, allowing those mineral resources, many of which are needed for renewable energy infrastructure, allow those resources to be exploited. So how do we do this? How do we actually release this pent-up investment money? The most important thing, I think everyone in the energy area agrees, is to speed up the building of transmission lines. So the energy regulator has identified many of the transmission lines that are needed. Often it's increasing the capacity between the main states that are on the national grid, so South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania. These lines get built very slowly because the regulation, so the economic regulation, I'm not talking about the environmental, takes years. And that could be sped up considerably if government funded the lines and sidestepped what can be 4 years of economic regulation. We're also asking for government to underwrite renewable energy industrial zones. So I'll talk a bit more about these later, but this is where you have an existing industrial area, let's say like Southeast Melbourne or the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, and you guarantee manufacturers in that area low-cost renewable energy. And the private sector can deliver that, but it's helped if the government underwrite it, which means it can be done in numerous ways, but it's something like the Victorian government did with reverse energy contracts to achieve their Victorian renewable energy target. And we should also ensure that where it makes sense, we build the renewable energy infrastructure in Australia. So I think the real opportunities are in wind, which I've mentioned, also batteries. Australia is a producer of 9 of the 10 metals and materials that go into modern batteries, lithium, cobalt, nickel, etc. So it makes sense for Australia to develop an industry processing those metals and developing a battery industry. So the biggest sector where we found jobs is in the building sector. It's really important for the 2 reasons on this screen. Buildings produce about 1/4 of Australia's emissions, and we could be seeing up to close to 500,000 job losses in the construction sector because of the slowdown in 2020. So our plan would help to tackle both of those things. Here are the areas where we could improve buildings and create jobs. I'm just going to talk about one of those areas, which is home energy retrofits. So in the report, we also talk about building energy efficient social housing. There's a big lack of social housing in Australia. By the government deciding to build social housing and energy efficient social housing, we can house a lot of homeless people or people at risk of homelessness. We can employ many of those people in the construction industry that are going to lose their jobs. And we can also upskill the construction industry in energy efficient building. But looking at energy retrofits, the reason they're important is that most of the emissions that come from buildings are because we have a building stock which is very energy inefficient. So just going back to the previous slide, we have a plan for retrofitting 2.5 million houses. That's about 1/4 of Australia's building stock in the next 5 years. And the first step in doing that is to make energy buildings much more efficient. So this is from our buildings plan in 2013. It shows how by addressing the inefficient lighting, heating systems, the thermal insulation of houses, you can get, you can in some cases reduce the energy use in buildings by 3/4. And once you've done that, it becomes a much easier task to provide the energy using solar panels, which are now affordable, and batteries. And I'm sure Renew has got similar drawings in some of their reports, which also show how buildings can be retrofitted. So this would be one great aspect of this in the current environment is that it's really labor intensive. It's not the sort of thing you can automate. It requires workers to go into houses, lay insulation, do draft proofing, and we are going to need to get houses in Victoria and Tasmania and other places off gas. So that means replacing gas boilers with electric heat pumps and also electric hot water heat pumps. So that would require about 100,000 people every year to carry out the retrofits, install solar panels, install batteries in some houses, and it would lead to a whole new industry which we've labelled professional services, which would grow over that time. So this makes a lot of sense because it would, apart from the benefits I've mentioned, it would reduce energy costs for people. But the big problem is how we're going to afford it, how we're going to afford these retrofits. So I think they would cost about $75 billion over the 5 years, which is, you know, even considering how much money is being thrown around at the moment by the government, that's a lot of money. But I'd like you to compare that 75 billion with the amount on the screen that Australian households are planning to spend on energy bills for the next 10 years, which is $250 billion. So I would love to challenge the finance industry, clever business people, for how we can convert this $250 billion, which is going to be spent anyway, into retrofits to make people's houses more comfortable and the energy bills lower. There must be a way of doing it, especially because a lot of that 2050 billion is actually going to be wasted because our houses are inefficient. So it's spent on gas and electricity that goes to heating, for example, that ends up heating the sky rather than our homes and ourselves. I've got one example that I'm going to talk about from Europe, which is one business model which can convert what we spend on energy bills into home energy retrofits, and it's called the Manager Energy Services Agreement. So what happens here is that you pay, a third party comes in, they take the upfront cost of the retrofit, they guarantee you an energy performance afterwards, they do the insulation, they replace your gas equipment with electric equipment, they install solar panels, they do whatever they think is necessary to make your home into a net energy producing house. And then instead of you paying an energy bill, you pay them an energy service fee in perpetuity. So it's a bit like your mobile phone contract, where a lot of people, they pay a flat fee, but in return for that, they might get, you get the phone, a certain amount of calls, a certain amount of download, but your fee becomes flat. So I think this is one way we could go in the for home energy. And there's a company in Europe, Dutch company Energiesprong, which is already doing this. So they come along, they give you a net zero energy retrofit in under a week. They like to do blocks of houses all at once. They then give a 30-year performance warranty. And as I say, there are no upfront costs, but it's paid for with an energy service fee afterwards. So one really exciting area of the energy transition is that it has the ability to revive Australian manufacturing. So Australian, as a proportion of the workforce, manufacture has been declining for 40 or 50 years in Australia. It used to be, for several decades, about a quarter of Australians were employed in manufacturing, and now it's, I think, about 9%. Actually, maybe lower than that, maybe 6 or 7. So it's gone down a lot, which it has in most developed countries, but not to the same extent. So there are countries like Germany, Japan, Italy, where more than twice as the amount of people or the proportion of the workforce is employed in manufacturing. And there are several opportunities for Australia to catch up with that from the energy transition. One is from electrifying industry. So Beyond Zero Emissions wrote a whole report about this. This is about how manufacturers, almost any manufacturing process you can think of that uses gas or sometimes coal, could be electrified, and therefore it could use renewable energy. Not only would that reduce emissions, but it would reduce the energy inputs, often by about a half. It often improves productivity, your control over the final product, has a lot of benefits. So converting manufacturing, just existing manufacturing, would be a huge job that we've calculated would create 60,000 jobs or job years. We've also looked at renewable hydrogen. That doesn't create, there's a lot of excitement about that nationally and politically. It doesn't create too many jobs in our 5-year period, because we see that it's going to take a little while to really ramp up that industry. But we think we should get started with some domestic demand. So a lot of the talk about hydrogen is that we're going to be an exporter of hydrogen, which I think is a possibility. But there are uses of hydrogen domestically. For example, making ammonia for fertilizers. Hydrogen is vital for that. We could do that. Or we could make hydrogen for very large trucks, which are hard to electrify. We also talk about the potential for renewable mining. Miners are getting on board with renewables because it's a cheaper way to produce energy. But to go fully zero carbon, they're also going to have to electrify or somehow get rid of the diesel from the machinery in the trucks and excavators and loaders, etc. That's another huge area for jobs. And one that I'm really interested in, I've also written a report about this for the University of Melbourne, is zero emissions metals. So Australia is one of the world's really significant miners and producers of metal ores, you know, iron ore and lithium, bauxite, which makes aluminium, etc. But most of those ores go on, we basically dig them up, put them on a boat and wave them off as rocks. And so we're selling them at the lowest point of the value chain, unprocessed. So with cheap renewable energy, we have an opportunity to process those metals here. So to make iron ore into steel, to make bauxite into aluminium. So I just want to dwell on the opportunity with aluminium, because it is an area many of you'll know we already have aluminium smelters in Australia. But unfortunately, they're living on borrowed time. Their owners, Rio Tinto and Alcoa, have strongly hinted that they may be on their way out. There's two main reasons for that. One is the cost of electricity. It's not cheap enough anymore, which makes the aluminium expensive, because about a third of the costs about making aluminium are in the electricity. And two, the electricity is too high carbon. Aluminium is probably ahead of the other metals in that a separate market is developing for sustainable low carbon aluminium. There are companies like BMW, Apple, Tetra Pak, Bosch that have committed to using only lower emissions aluminium. And Rio Tinto and Alcoa are responding. Alcoa have said that I think it's by 2030, or it might be sooner than that, they're going to source 85% of their energy from renewable resources. And electricity in Australia doesn't fit in with that vision at the moment. So the only future for the 4 smelters we have in Australia is low cost renewable clean energy, which can now be done. We can now produce reliable clean electricity cheap enough to make that possible. And in fact, I think to have more aluminium plants in Australia. And if we do that, we get a bonus because modern smelters can now be made so they operate flexibly. Traditionally, they just needed the same electricity input day in, day out, 24 hours a day. They can be made to operate flexibly. And if you have something the size of an aluminium smelter operating flexibly in the grid, that can actually support grid reliability and the supply and demand balance of electricity, which needs to be maintained at all times. This is being done actually in Germany. There's a smelter that has this technology installed that enables it to operate flexibly. And that smelter now says that it makes more money from the electricity market than it does from making and selling aluminium. Another example in the metal sector I really like is Element 25. So this is going to be a new mine and metals producer in Western Australia. They're going to produce high purity manganese, which has use in batteries and other renewable energy infrastructure. They have done analysis which shows that if they use up to 90% renewable electricity, that's the cheapest way forward for them. And it will reduce their cost of production and allow them to compete with China. And allow them to produce a product with very low embodied emissions, which their potential customers are very keen on. So this is the sort this is just one example of the sort of project that I think could be repeated again and again throughout Australia with metal ores, not just selling them as ores, but producing them here using renewable energy. So electrified transport, we didn't cover all aspects of this. We didn't cover cars, for example, but just looking at buses, electrification of regional rail and cycling, we came up with 140,000 jobs. Electric transport has many advantages over existing transport. It's quieter, it's cleaner, it's usually faster, has lower running costs, less maintenance costs. What's not to like about it? Electric buses, we keep talking about trials of electric buses in Australia. Not sure what we're trialing. Electric buses, there are about 500,000 of them in the world operating today. Many major cities have them or are expanding them, London, Paris, Mexico City. There's a city in China called Shenzhen, which in 3 years switched to its whole bus fleet, 16,000 buses, to electric. So electric buses are a mature technology now. Not only that, but Australia's bus fleet, which is diesel, 99%, is pretty old and could do with replacement. So if we replace those, we'll give a big boost to the bus builders. Buses are mostly built, as in assembled in Australia. We'll give a big boost to them and the whole bus supply chain, which is also pretty significant. We also talk about electrifying the railways. So this is becoming more and more common internationally. Again, electric trains are just better than diesel trains. They're actually cheaper to buy up front, as well as all the other advantages. So I think we saw about 70,000 jobs coming from electrifying 3,000 kilometers of regional rail, things like, well, I'm in Ballarat, so I included Melbourne to Ballarat. And amongst the other benefits, it would halve the travel time on many of those journeys, which would be a great benefit to regional towns. We also talk about cycling. Cycling is actually one of the opportunities in our report that gives the biggest bang for your buck in terms of investment. So for every $1 million invested in cycling, you create 6 jobs building cycle lanes. That's because cycle lanes is really about labor and not materials. So let's get going with cycling. It's not only low carbon, but obviously low potential for catching coronavirus, so pretty relevant at the moment. This is one of those rail examples that I was talking about that is crying out for investment. So the journey from Sydney to our capital Canberra takes something like 4 hours. It might be 4.5 hours. It's incredible, really. It's a slow train, gives you lots of opportunity to admire the New South Wales countryside. With some investment, we could halve those travel times. That's without even talking about high-speed rail, which would be a great benefit to the many people that travel between Sydney and Canberra, but very few of them at the moment by rail. I mentioned high-speed rail there. Beyond Zero Emissions is a big proponent of high-speed rail being built between Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. We didn't include jobs from high-speed rail in this because we just didn't think that they could get going in 5 years' time, but we still think that should happen over a longer period. And it's really the best way of tackling the emissions from especially the Sydney to Melbourne air route, which has now become the second most popular air route in the world. So land restoration and carbon farming can also create a lot of jobs. It can create them very quickly. It can create jobs for low-skilled people. We looked at revegetating 27 million hectares of land. So especially vital now, given how much of our ecosystems were devastated in the bushfires at the start of the year. We need to give a lot more love to our ecosystems and make them more resilient to bushfires in the future. We've got the potential to reduce national emissions by 5% each year just by drawing down carbon through growing trees and other vegetation. And one of the other things this could do is create jobs for Indigenous people. So there's a great project in Northern Australia where Indigenous rangers use traditional burning practices, cool burning, etc., which reduce the likelihood and the intensity of bushfires, and among other things, reduces the emissions that come from bushfires and enables those Indigenous rangers to create an income for themselves and also earn carbon credits for Indigenous communities. So I probably skirted over, didn't give full justice to the land section. That's because that was an area of the report that I didn't write, but I think it is a really key opportunity. So what's next? I'm just going to check how I'm doing for time. Yeah, I should probably wrap up soon. So how do we make this happen? There's a lot of things governments could do. I won't go through them all. But one thing is just to convey the size of the opportunity to state and federal governments. I mentioned the New South Wales government. I think they're starting to really realise, if you look at the comments coming out of the New South Wales government, not just about renewable energy, but about buses and industry, they're starting to realise that tackling climate change isn't just a sort of matter of grinning and bearing it. It's a massive opportunity for the country. It could create more jobs, stimulate the economy, reduce bills for us and businesses, improve energy security, create cleaner air. You know, what's not to like? So that's one of my ambitions with Beyond Zero Emissions Million Jobs Plan and our broader work, to convey this sense of opportunity so it just becomes a competition between political parties to then seize the opportunity. Other more tangible things that the government could do is it could make available cheap capital. It's never been cheaper to borrow. The federal government can borrow at less than 1%. So something like the retrofit example, that could be stimulated with cheap capital borrowed at less than 1%. The government will need to pay for some things. So a lot of the things in this report are about stimulating private sector investment. But we do call for the government to pay for some new transmission lines, the electrification of rail, and also social housing. And we need policies to encourage domestic manufacture. So things like local content requirements and sustainable procurement policies. What has BZE been doing about the report since we launched it? Well, we had some great media attention, articles written about us and on television, including perhaps the not usual suspects. So the Australian Sky News gave us favourable write-ups for the plan. Mike Cannon-Brookes talked at length about it on ABC Business. And we've been presenting to lots of influential groups like unions, the National COVID Commission, the Australian Industry Group. And generally, we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but got a pretty good response. And our next step is setting up meetings with state politicians and governments, and also at the federal level. We've had some economic analysis done of what this plan would mean. I can't reveal the results of that economic analysis, but it shows good things for GDP, job creation, and what it would do to real wages. We've also created a long list of projects. So we put out a call to proponents for projects that aligned with the vision of the Million Jobs Plan. We got an incredible response to that call. We got 700 people logging projects with us in renewable energy, transport industry, etc. And we're going to be releasing that as an online interactive map. And if you're interested, if you like the idea of this report and you're interested to know what you could do, then I suggest you could do worse than contacting your local representatives and telling them about the report and saying, how are you going to make this happen? So that's all for me. Thanks for listening. It's always difficult talking to a silent screen for a few minutes, but I hope you find that interesting. I'm looking forward to a Q&A session.
Questions coming up. So we'll do our best. We've consolidated some of them, and we'll do as many as we can. So I shall bring those up. So the first one is from Peter Morgan. In essence, does the Million Jobs Plan bring the BZE reports from 2010 and onwards into one package for our COVID times? And what has changed in the last 10 years, except for the sense of urgency?
Yeah, sense of urgency's only got greater. Yeah, that sounds like a question that I planted, but I didn't. Yeah, there's not much more to say apart from what the questioner said. This was BZE's moment because we have been saying for 10 years how we can eliminate emissions in all these sectors, and always saying that it'd be good for the economy and would create jobs. So exactly, the Million Jobs Plan is kind of a review of all that work and just a repackaging of it for this moment. What's changed, it's the sense of urgency, but also the task was always doable with the right will, but it's just become easier. In 10 years, the cost of solar panels is the standout example, has dropped by more than 80%. That was against expectations, really, and wind has also dropped by 40 or 50%, which is also, people thought wind had stopped coming down the cost chain, but it hasn't. So those price reductions enable a lot of this plan to happen.
Yeah, we've also had great advances, I think, partly through you, on electrifying industry, which I think was one of the great breakthroughs in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I don't think anyone, and still not many people are, to be honest, was talking about how industry doesn't need to use gas. It can make all the things it makes, in fact, more efficiently in other ways. And one of those ways is renewable electricity. So
Janet's the next one. Some real doubts on recycling, especially plastic reuse. The petrochemical industry has perpetrated a hoax in similar fashion to the tobacco industry, so that the oil and gas industry can continue to produce vast amounts of plastic, even as fossil fuel reductions are cutting into their profits. I notice you have used the industry's recycle logo, so have you also been fooled?
I'm not sure of the full context behind that question, but it does give me an opportunity to mention recycling, because it was part of our plan, but I didn't include it there. It wasn't one of the bigger jobs creators. But we suggest a target of 90% recycling by 2025, which is actually the target in the ACT. So it's doable, and it's one area that already has a lot of political backing and money behind it. They're not quite as ambitious as we would be. But if you do recycle plastics and other things, then you don't need to make the virgin product. I think you're always going to need some virgin plastic. But if you're recycling 80 to 90% of it, you've already got it. You don't need to start again from oil or gas.
Yeah, good question, good answer. And from Colin, surprised to see reference to batteries rather than pumped hydro, or is the technology now considered to be a battery?
Yeah, we don't particularly back batteries over pumped hydro. I think there's room for both of them, and in fact, other storage technologies. Beyond Zero Emissions is associated with concentrated solar power, which is also effectively a way of storing solar energy. So I think those, also stored hydrogen, they're all ways that we can store energy, and I think we're going to need them all. There was a great report funded by ARENA a couple of years ago about dispatchable renewables, and I think it reviewed 6 different dispatchable renewables, and it said there's probably a role for all of them, but just at different time scales. So batteries are great at 1 hour, 2 hours, or lower, a few seconds in frequency markets. They're probably not so great for long-term storage of a week or a month, but that's where something like pumped hydro would come in. So yeah, I didn't mean to say there's only one answer to storage. There's a few answers.
Good. And Barnes says, not quite sure if I get 100% renewable mining. Lithium is not coal, for example. So what mining do you want to keep?
We need all of it that's not fossil fuel mining. That's the short answer. We can't get away. We can't talk about having more batteries, more solar panels, more wind turbines, and electric vehicles without talking about the things they're made of, which is metals by and large. So something like lithium, we need it, but we need to mine it we need to mine and process it in a zero carbon way. That's also healthier for the people at mine sites, by the way. The issue of diesel particulates causing cancer has been described as a ticking time bomb. So the sooner mines, especially underground mines, but also overground, get away from using diesel, the better from a health point of view.
Yeah, and I noticed the BHP CEO today in their annual general meeting announced that they're trying to get out of coal, thermal coal completely, and go into nickel and cobalt and copper because of the renewable growth.
Yeah, which is good news. And also recently an announcement from BP, one of the world's biggest oil companies, saying they intend to reduce oil and gas production by 40% by 2030.
Yeah, and the processing of the minerals into metal can all be electrified, which is currently often done with coal or gas.
Yes, it depends. Well, it depends on which process and which metals. Many metals are actually made in a process which is the main energy input is already electricity. So steel is the major exception in terms of emissions. So many of them can be made renewable without completely changing the underlying process.
Yeah. Peter Morgan asks, solar thermal was a core part of BZE's stationary energy in 2010. So what now?
Where is solar thermal? Look, I think solar thermal's still got a role. Its costs are actually still coming down. It's still being built. I believe there's more storage. If you see solar thermal as a way of storage, there's more storage in solar thermal still than batteries globally. So I think it's still got a role, but it's not going to be the basis of the grid, which I think BZE once spoke about, and that was because solar PV was so expensive just 10 years ago that it wasn't the cheapest way of doing it. Now solar PV and wind have blown all the competition out of the water in terms of the kind of main way of generating renewables.
Yeah. And Les Selden says, if Australia might need solar panels for the next, say, 200 years, do you propose importing them from China for the next 200 years? And at what cost? And would it be better to start making them here?
Well, possibly. I mean, I'm not against importing some of the things we need. I mentioned in the presentation that I see there's more potential in manufacturing batteries and wind turbines here. I think there is one small manufacturer of solar here, but it's just done so cheaply overseas, it's quite hard to compete. So maybe it's a good idea as having more than one supply source and not just China. But yeah, I don't see Australia becoming a big manufacturer, but happy to be proven wrong.
And Germany says, how much improvement did the big Pink Bats program actually achieve?
Well, I mean, we know that the Pink Bats was not a success. There have been several reviews of that program and a Royal Commission to say, well, one, why some people died installing Pink Bats, and two, why it didn't achieve. It wasn't installed properly in many cases. So I think it's a valid thing to raise. We have to ensure that if we're going to do lots of retrofits, that there is proper oversight and proper regulation, which creates more jobs, I have to say. One thing is, in the current situation, is that there are likely to be a lot of unemployed but skilled people from the construction industry who do understand how to carry out retrofits on houses.
Yeah. And Peter asks, you mentioned the potential role for manufacturing batteries. What about pumped hydro, especially off-river pumped hydro, attached to the large-scale solar or wind energy production?
Yeah, I think I kind of answered that. I think pumped hydro has got a role.
And he's doing more than just Snowy 2, so more generally.
Yeah, I agree. And I mentioned that we put out a call for projects, and several of those responses were smaller scale pumped hydro, smaller than Snowy 2.
In one of your previous reports, I think you found 25,000 pumped hydro sites around the southeast.
Yeah, I think that was actually ANU research. We have referred to it, but there are loads of pumped hydro opportunities, often related to mining. Mine sites dig big pits, right? So be a good use for them afterwards. And
Tim Forsey, who's on this, asked a question a minute ago, wrote a report about it as well, which was, I remember, very good.
Yeah.
From Vicky, you state that the construction industry contributes about 25% of greenhouse gases. Do you propose that retrofitting will consider embodied energy in materials, appliances, etc., as supply chains and embodied energy makes up that 25%, not just building energy efficiency?
Yeah, I think it needs to be considered. That 25% figure actually includes the embodied energy in buildings. So while everything we build with has some kind of embodied energy and embodied emissions, the two standout materials that produce a lot of those are concrete, and so cement and concrete and steel. We've written about how the emissions from both of those can be reduced and eliminated. So, for example, with cement and concrete, there are alternative cements that we could be using that don't produce emissions. There's a number of strategies that we could be using, but I think it's right to raise embodied emissions, and it's right that we should, in any strategy, we should quantify them and take them into account.
And I'd recommend people look at your two previous reports on rethinking cement and electrifying industry.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah. Rob says, no mention of steel production by direct reduction of iron ore with hydrogen.
I'm really keen on that. I'd be happy to give a whole talk on that. Steel is in the report. It doesn't create too many jobs because building a steel plant is not a thing you do overnight, but it does create some jobs. So we foresee in the plan two direct, exactly as the questioner mentioned, direct reduction plants using hydrogen. So this is a longer term, if this was a jobs plan for 20 years, this could have huge employment potential. Australia is the world's biggest exporter of iron ore, make very little steel. There's basically two steel plants. But we could have a steel industry as big as Japan's using basically two inputs, the iron ore, which we've got, and renewable energy.
And it would save on freight, presumably, as well, because
yeah,
you're shipping a lot less material and nice
cubic
shapes.
Yeah, and the wind towers that we make here could be made with Australian steel.
And from Barnes, as you electrify a transport sector, what about the lost jobs of PPL? Who maintains the systems? Is that significant?
People.
Yeah.
The lost jobs of people. Yeah. I mean, I should be upfront that when we counted jobs, we didn't count lost jobs in that in coal-fired power stations or the transport sector. So yeah, I should admit that we didn't do that. But overall, it's easily in the net positive in terms of job creation. So do you think that question is about electrically propelled machinery tends to require less maintenance than an internal combustion engine? Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. But I think transport is going to be electrified anyway because it has so many benefits in terms of, reliability, speed, efficiency, cost, that it's going to happen.
And that applies in the whole of the maintenance of vehicles, which is less. And as controls get better on vehicles, then there'll be less crashes. So there's all the crash repair.
That's a good point, Rob.
As well.
But in the short term, there's a huge job to be done. We need the charging stations, we need to build the chargers, we need to electrify rail lines, we need to build the buses. So that's going to keep people in work for quite a while.
From Tam, hello to a perfect panel and audience. I'll read that out. I'd like to know how a council or a university who wants its operations to be emissions free when trucks they use for various reasons still use diesel. So who are making and when by in Australia, in Melbourne, who's making electric buses, etc.
Who's making you can Google a whole load of manufacturers of electric buses and trucks. Yeah, they'd be available. They're not common in Australia yet, but they are common throughout the world. And companies that do a lot of delivery, like Amazon and others, are going. They're investing heavily in electric vehicles because they're cleaner and the lower running costs and the lower maintenance costs.
Is there an opportunity there in some of the areas where there's currently coal mining or supporting coal mining to take on some of those industries to be building electric trucks or electric buses and the likes?
I think it's essential that. Look, even the New South Wales government has admitted recently that they have to plan for the phase out of coal. So it's essential that we try and create as many jobs as possible to help with the transition of communities that are currently reliant on fossil fuels, which are going to be phased out. So yeah, many of these manufacturing jobs can be created in places like the Hunter Valley. I should have mentioned actually Beyond Zero Emissions has got a project going on in the Hunter Valley, which is one of the big coal areas, as you know, to apply this research at the local level in the Hunter. So we've got a project called I can't say it, but Diversifying the Hunter. So yeah, building transmission lines, manufacturing renewable energy infrastructure, building buses, all these jobs can be in places that currently where there are miners, and use similar skills to the skills that exist, technical skills to the skills that exist in those areas.
Good. I mean, that's a great transition method because they're good jobs for a long-term future. Yeah.
Yeah.
Next one from Janet's maybe a bit political. How about a mining super tax to pay for some of this? And maybe I'll generalize that question as who pays in general for all of this? And
yeah, well, just on the mining one, I probably won't go on the mining super tax, but I won't touch that one. But I do think that the tax regime has a role to play in incentivizing domestic processing of metals, which, as I said, is something I'm really keen on. We could use the tax and royalty regime to make it less attractive to export ores and more attractive to process them here. Who pays for it all? There are certain things where I think there's no getting away from the fact that the government will pay for it all, but let's remember that the government is looking for ways to stimulate the economy and has already spent, I think it's something like 250 billion in stimulus so far, and more stimulus money will have to keep coming to get us out of the hole we're in. So let's make sure that that stimulus money has a lasting benefit. But most of it will be private sector investment. So I mentioned that there's 160 gigawatts of renewables in the pipeline. Those developers are not expecting public money to pay for that. They're expecting private finance to come to the party. And the same for many of the opportunities I've spoken about in manufacturing and other sectors. It will be private sector money. And there's never been a better time to get private sector money because it's so cheap to borrow.
Yep, and you mentioned the electric grid one in New South Wales, and generating renewable power there was oversubscribed.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From Jeff, how do we get the government to encourage electric vehicles? Maybe that's governments.
Yeah, how do we get governments to? I mean, you know, I said at the end there, if you like the plan, contact your local representative, but do the same about electric vehicles. There's really very few incentives in Australia to encourage the switch to electric vehicles. They're already cheaper. I mean, they're more expensive to buy, but the cost of ownership of them is already cheaper. So there's a big benefit from them waiting to happen. But in those countries where they are successful, like Norway and other European countries, there's a whole load of policies and incentives backing that up. We're not seeing any of it here. So yeah, contact your local representative to make it happen.
And that could be another regional thing as well. So we could do Tasmania or rural areas first, which would be quite handy.
Yeah.
From Mark, the electricity distributors face a lot of criticism several years ago about gold plating the poles and wires. Do you feel the works in the period were justified, and will it help with the new renewable generation capacity?
Do I think the work in that period was justified?
Yeah, and will it be useful now?
To be honest, I'm going to say I don't know enough about that. I don't know enough about what the gold plating was. Yeah, so I just reiterate my comments that we certainly now need more investment in that sector, particularly for transmission, which is needed to move renewable energy from where we produce it to the cities where we use it.
think my understanding would be that, yeah, it's in the wrong place, the gold plating. So
Right.
we need to spend a lot more.
Yeah.
Antonio, rare minerals, the way they are extracted in China is not very good for the environment. We probably should start doing them here in Australia. Also, recycling EV car batteries should be 100%.
Totally agree with both those points. I really like that point about how, you know, mining is potentially a very damaging industry, but and sometimes it's done badly in Australia, but at least we do have regulations here, and we have environmental standards, which sometimes are completely ignored in other countries. So, you know, that is an argument for doing more of it here. Yeah, I agree.
And recycling EV car batteries?
Yes, I agree with that too. If we'd have had more time, we'd have put recycling of batteries into the report. Yeah, and that's going to become, you know, a big issue in a few years' time.
And from Malcolm, how long does BZE consider before gas demand can be eliminated? And is there already sufficient gas infrastructure to last until then?
Well, BZE has long said that we can decarbonise in 10 years. We still stand by that. In fact, it's easier now than when we started saying it. So if we decarbonise in 10 years, we won't use any gas. So yes, to the answer, we've got enough infrastructure now. Gas demand in Australia has been declining for several years. See no reason why it would go up. You know, there are 3 uses of gas. There's domestic use for mostly heating, there's electricity production, and there's heat for industry. Our reports cover alternatives, in fact, better alternatives for all those uses.
And certainly in the use in electricity has been declining quite significantly in the last year.
Indeed, yeah.
Because gas is the most expensive, and
yeah.
its benefit of being quick to respond has been reduced by other items, like the renewables have got cleverer.
Yeah, and batteries are taking the market share in South Australia. Yeah, that's right.
From Tam, what kind of renewable technology gives the highest value add, please? Our leaders always make us our manufacturing behind and miss the chance. I think that should be lag behind. Yeah.
Look, I guess it's just case dependent on. I find it hard to answer that in the abstract. Yeah.
You're probably saying wind and not solar from a manufacturing point of view, aren't you?
Oh, from the profit made by the manufacturer?
Well, not just the profit, but for manufacturing in Australia, I think you probably would say go wind first.
Oh, yeah. So I'm saying that there's the potential. Wind turbines are normally made in the market they're in, so providing the market's big enough. Yeah.
And from Russell, all in favour of traditional burns, which are very labour intensive, just can't see how it makes a positive carbon impact. So this is your burning in Northern Territory, predominantly traditional burning.
Oh, how it makes a positive carbon impact. So if you do a cool burn, that prevents a much hotter, more devastating fire, you have reduced emissions because you know, you've prevented that fire, which would have reduced a lot more emissions and caused a lot more damage.
And I think as a bit of an aside, wasn't in the burns over December, February, almost equivalent to the whole of Australia's normal output?
Yeah, you might be right.
It's huge.
You might be right.
But it's not counted because reputedly they're all going to regrow.
Yeah, well, we hope so.
And from Vicky, when it comes to building products, concrete has the highest embodied energy, and its significant use in the built-up environment contributes to the heat island effect. Is there anything in the plan that considers concrete production or its application?
No, but Rob, you mentioned before, and I think it came up in the chat, Imogen put the link up, we wrote a whole report about cement and concrete, and exactly that, the embodied emissions related to them and what we could do about them. So we do need some cement and concrete, you know, foundations for big buildings, for example, building Melbourne Metro, can't really do it without cement and concrete, but we could certainly use less. One of the ways we had of using less was to use timber. You can build quite tall buildings now with timber, and we can produce concrete or cement and concrete in other ways without producing the emissions.
Do you want to say any more about that? Because that was a fascinating report I found at the time.
Oh, thanks.
Alternatives, and maybe, again, that gives jobs in some of the coal mining areas, would it not?
Yeah, you're right. So you remember the report well. So one of the ways of cement, so most of the emissions in concrete are from cement, which is the binder in concrete. Most of the emissions from cement are not from the energy input. They are from the fact that you take raw limestone and you heat it and you drive out the carbon dioxide in that limestone. And that's the way we've been making cement, called Portland cement, for 200 years. We can make cement in other ways that either use less limestone or use no limestone at all. So we get rid of those emissions. And one of the substitute materials that has most potential is fly ash, which is a byproduct of burning coal in coal-fired power stations. At the moment, some fly ash is used, and it's what you might call fresh fly ash. So you need it's just being produced from the burning, but we've got hundreds of millions of tons of fly ash sitting next to power stations, closed and open, that some of which we could use to replace cement. So we should start investigating that and treating it as a resource.
Is there much research being done on that by universities or anything?
Not in Australia, unless it's happened since I stopped looking at cement, but in other countries there is. So there was a project in the United Kingdom to look at, United Kingdom, you might know, has pretty much stopped coal-fired generation of electricity. There's a tiny amount continuing, but there was a project to investigate the fly ash at every current and past power station in the UK to see how suitable it was for use in cement. We should do the same here.
Yeah, great. And from Claire, big mining pulls the purse strings of government. It seems that they're the government sometimes. The coal and gas industry are a formidable force. Do you think underlying political economic structures will come along for the ride with a shared vision?
Well, look, I mean, there's no denying the political power of large corporations. Only a minority would be against the vision we're outlining, right? I mentioned 1,000 companies worldwide that have committed to emissions reductions targets in line with the Paris Agreement, and that's just in one forum called the Science Based Targets Initiative. There are probably other forums, I haven't counted them all. So much of business is in favour of this. I had those quotes up at the start about support for a green stimulus. I could have had a quote from the Business Council of Australia, which said that something like every dollar we invest in energy should be an investment in clean energy. So, business isn't uniform. Much of it is in favour of the transition we're talking about, and much of it would benefit from it. And the other point is, business does have political power, but not 100% of it. Some large percentage of it resides with the electorate, which is us. We need to make our voices known.
Yeah. And from Richard, I love the plan, but how much traction is it, if any, is it getting with our elected representatives? I'm guessing not much from the coalition, given Energy Minister Angus Taylor stated enthusiasm for a national gas-fired economic recovery. Is there any hope of talking them around or adopting at least part of what you're proposing?
Well, we've got a voice. That's the good thing. We've had enough coverage and got enough support from influential third parties that we've got a voice. Governments, including the federal government and the Prime Minister's office, know about the report. and they're going to hear more about it. So we'll be spending a lot of the rest of this year making the case for the green recovery, which I think is a very strong case.
Great. And from Vicky, transmission lines. With global warming a reality now and more storms, lightning strikes, etc., is there any reason why transmission lines are not put underground to stop heat affecting wires and lightning strikes or arcing starting bushfires?
Well, I think the reason is the huge cost, especially when you're talking about, you know, the missing transmission lines in Australia. Some of them are 1,000 kilometers long. Putting that underground would be several times more expensive. Yeah, and actually disturb more ground as well. So from an approvals point of view, it'd be more complicated. So I think it would be great to put them underground if it was possible, but I think it's going to be unlikely. But coming to their resilience to extreme weather, I think that's really important, and becoming more important because essentially we're arguing that we electrify everything. So that only increases the importance of the electricity grid. So we need to make sure that it is super reliable and resilient to extreme weather events that we're likely to see more of.
Yeah. And from Tonat, if we had standards for car emissions that would help with the support of electric vehicles, correct?
Yeah, good point. Should have mentioned that earlier. That was on, probably a lot of people saw, was it Fight for Planet A on ABC last night? He was talking about that. Yeah, one of the only, probably the only developed country that doesn't have any carbon emission standards on vehicles. Strange.
Yeah. And from Russell, how about putting third-party insurance into the cost of petrol, which would make electric cars more cost competitive, just to placate the transport diesel sector? Just have to placate the transport diesel sector.
Possibly, yeah. I don't know about that one. Maybe, but anything that could, I think the side effects of burning petrol should be included in the cost, carbon emissions and pollution. Yeah.
And from Janet, I understood that fly ash was toxic.
Yeah, so some fly ash is toxic. That would be one of the things that would have to be studied before approving it for use in concrete. I mean, some limestone's toxic, right? So not a good idea to make that into cement either. So we just need standards. We need to measure what's in the fly ash. We need some standards. There is an argument that the fly ash is already there in fairly unsealed dams. There have been several instances of it blowing around from closed power stations. By locking it away in concrete, we're locking away any toxins. But we'd still need standards. There are things like radiation we don't want to bring into our built environment. So yeah, it's a good point.
And linked to that is somebody pointing out that the fly ash was used by the Romans, wasn't it? Who built the Colosseum, which is still standing.
Yeah, ash certainly was. I mean, not fly ash because they didn't have coal-fired power stations, as far as I know. But volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius was certainly used by the Romans in some of their cement, and some of those structures, like the Colosseum, are still standing today. So they obviously knew what they were doing.
Right, and from Peter, how did you as an individual and an organisation, BZE, last literally 10 plus years in the face of apathy and pushback? How do you maintain hope?
Well, we've had some turnover, so I think it's still possible, right? It's still possible to reduce emissions and restrict warming. I mean, 1.5 degrees is going to be tough now, but certainly below 2 degrees. And 2 degrees is better than 2.5 degrees, and 2.5 degrees is better than 3 degrees. And so it's still, to a certain extent, in our hands. And while it's in our hands, I think it's important to maintain hope and to remain as positive as we can. I won't say that I remain positive in every moment, and sometimes I'm not despairing, and sometimes it's difficult to bring the same energy to it. But we still do have hope, so we have to fight.
And now I might finish off with a couple of questions. What is some good examples of what's happening in Australia in this field?
Some good examples.
What would happen?
I'm worried I'm not going to say I'm going to think of the best things afterwards. I think the fact that at a state level, we've got 3 states with Liberal coalition governments now, South Australia, New South Wales, Tasmania, who are all wildly in favour of renewable energy. South Australia are looking towards 100% renewable energy by 2030. Yeah, 2030. Tasmania is looking at 200% renewable energy. We've mentioned a few times some of the great things happening in New South Wales. So I think, you know, politically, it means things have changed. You know, there's still some further to go at the federal level, but that really gives me hope that we can see an end in sight to the wars over this. Well, I hope the wars over this become, you know, who can be most ambitious and who can back this vision the best. I hope that becomes the battle. So that's one that I'd give. I mentioned the Element 25 project, which I really like. Actually, the copper string transmission project is really exciting in that it releases new areas for renewable energy. It brings cleaner energy to all of us that are those of us who are on the national electricity market, and opens up new areas in Western Queensland for mining and processing of minerals that we need for renewables. So that ticks a lot of boxes.
Yeah, that's a pretty good go. What things would you like us to do? And 150 odd people are watching you. What should we do to make a difference?
Well, I presume all of you care already about this, which is why you're joining a webinar with Renew. And thanks again for listening. I think the best thing is to contact your elected representatives, tell them about our plan, and reiterate this point that this is an exciting moment for Australia and there's such an opportunity to be had. Let's not miss it.